So in the last lecture we considered reform before the Reformation in England. That is kind of people who started to take an interest in evangelical ideas before Henry himself became involved. In this lecture we're going to be thinking about the role of Henry VIII in the early English Reformation, and in particular in the circumstances leading up to the break with Rome, which is one of the most important aspects of the Henrician Reformation and one of Henry's most enduring legacies. I mean, if we start off by considering the religion of Henry VIII, the kind of the young prince, who of course was never supposed to be king because it was his elder brother Arthur who was supposed to be king. Unfortunately, Arthur died soon after he married Catherine of Aragon, and so Henry is sort of groomed for kingship and becomes king in 1509, and then very quickly marries his brother's widow. They secure a papal dispensation, so he can marry Catherine of Aragon, who's been sort of hanging around the place for about 7 years without very much to do. And insofar as we don't really know very much about Henry's religion, but what we do know suggests that he's conventionally pious in many respects. He seems to visit shrines, such as the shrine at Walsingham, sort of going on pilgrimage. He gives money to support religious institutions like monasteries. He takes part in a ceremony which takes place during Holy Week on Good Friday, creeping to the cross. So he takes part in many of the sort of aspects of traditional late medieval Catholic religion. Henry also seems to be a loyal son of the papacy. Henry obtains his dispensation to marry Catherine of Aragon from the papacy, and when Luther in 1520 writes a book attacking the sacramental system of the Catholic Church and denouncing the Pope as Antichrist, a book called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, Henry responds in person. Henry puts pen to paper and produces something called the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, the defence of the seven sacraments. He probably has a bit of help. He probably has some help from Thomas More, his friend, his mentor, the sort of humanist and Lord Chancellor. But Henry's name goes on the front of this treatise. It's a defence of the seven sacraments, a defence of the authority of the papacy. And this is pretty much unheard of in early 16th century England, that a crowned monarch should write a sort of theological treatise with his name on it and publish it for all to read. This is pretty extraordinary. And Henry's efforts are rewarded by the papacy, and the papacy grants him a special title. They call him Fide Defensor, or Defender of the Faith. And this is a title which English monarchs still claim to this day. So all signs are that Henry is sort of conventionally pious and that he is a loyal son of the Catholic Church. And so he is for much of his early life. Other than the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, he's really more concerned with things like with banquets and tournaments, and war with France occupies a lot of his time. He sort of dreams of recapturing the glories of his namesake ancestor Henry V, who won the Battle of Agincourt. So Henry's priorities are really sort of military and about having a good time, and also dynastic. It's easy to think of the Tudors as a sort of an indelible mark in British history, as a strong dynasty. But of course, Henry's father, Henry VII, picked up the crown from the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 after almost a century of civil war and conflict in the form of the Wars of the Roses. So Henry himself, Henry VIII, is only the second Tudor monarch, and his clear priority throughout his reign is to ensure a strong and stable succession, and to do that he needs to have at least one son. So Henry's marriage with Catherine seems to be going pretty well. They have a daughter, the young Princess Mary, but unfortunately Catherine's history in terms of sort of pregnancy and reproduction is a very difficult and very unhappy one. She has a series of miscarriages and stillbirths, and Henry is never able to obtain the son and heir that he wants to carry on the Tudor name and to inherit the crown from him. So towards the middle of the 1520s, I suppose, Henry, who's had mistresses before, but his eye is starting to wander, and he starts to become convinced that his marriage with Catherine is destined to be fruitless, destined not to result in a male heir. And in fact, he starts to feel that the Pope should never have really allowed him to get married to Catherine in the first place, because of course there needed to be a papal dispensation, because Catherine was the widow of Henry's elder brother Arthur, who died shortly after their marriage. And Henry starts to think, well, perhaps I shouldn't have married my brother's wife. You know, she was his widow at the time, but perhaps that was wrong. Perhaps God feels that was wrong. Perhaps that's why I'm not having a son. Perhaps the Pope should never have given that dispensation in the first place. So that's sort of the context, and then towards the later 1520s, a young woman who spent time at the French court comes over to England and catches Henry's eye, and that woman is of course Anne Boleyn. And unlike most of the mistresses Henry has had before, Anne is unwilling to succumb to Henry's advances unless she has some kind of formal position. Essentially, Anne says to Henry, no, I'm not going to sort of progress things with you. I don't want to be your mistress. I want to be your wife. I want to be queen. Now, ordinarily, as we've already seen, popes were pretty happy to grant sort of marital dispensations to facilitate the sort of dynastic alliances of early 16th century Europe. Unfortunately for Henry, in the latter half of the 1520s, the Pope is effectively being sort of held hostage in the Castel Sant'Angelo following the sacking of Rome by imperial forces commanded by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Now, even more unfortunately for Henry, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, was actually the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's wife. So the person Henry wants to sort of cast off, the woman he's been married to for many years, is the aunt of the most powerful man in Europe, who sort of currently has the Pope in his pocket. So Henry turns to his sort of chief minister, his great fixer, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, a cardinal legate, so the Pope's representative in England. And he turns to Wolsey to sort of fix this. This becomes known as Henry's Great Matter, and leads to a series of complex divorce negotiations, although it's really an annulment that Henry is seeking, but it's often sort of termed a series of divorce negotiations, and fundamentally Wolsey is not able to gain traction. All sorts of things are alleged. It's alleged that Catherine, the dispensation was granted on the basis that Catherine had not consummated her marriage with Henry's brother Arthur, and so there are all sorts of very unpleasant sort of testimonies and trying to decide whether or not, you know, Catherine was still a virgin at the point that she was contracted to marry Henry. But anyway, all of this fails to get the result that Henry wants. It fails to result in an end to that marriage. Wolsey sort of falls from grace and dies shortly thereafter. And so Henry starts casting around for other solutions to this marital difficulty. First of all, he turns to a Boleyn family chaplain, the young Thomas Cranmer, who becomes a key figure later on in the Reformation. And Cranmer is sent around Europe to try to gather opinions from European universities to rule favourably on Henry's case. Henry then turns to history and to the law to try to build up a sort of a dossier of evidence to support his case, which becomes known as the Collectanea Satis Copiosa, or the sufficiently large collection, a sort of a dodgy dossier of precedent to back up Henry's sort of legal and religious case. Finally, the spotlight falls on a young former sort of protege of Thomas Wolsey, the common lawyer and former mercenary Thomas Cromwell. And it's Cromwell who encourages Henry to pursue a sort of a parliamentary approach to solving his difficulty. So there's a whole series of acts of parliament designed to sort of humble the clergy and put them in their place. The clergy of England are charged with a crime called praemunire, which is exercising in a foreign and illegal jurisdiction. There is then a submission of the clergy. The English Parliament passes an Act in Restraint of Appeals, which says that all matters that arise within the English Church must be dealt within England. They mustn't be sort of sent out to Rome. And finally, in 1534, Henry and Parliament publish an Act of Supremacy, an act which declares that Henry VIII is to be the supreme head on earth of the Church of England, and that the Bishop of Rome, as he is called, no longer the Pope, but the Bishop of Rome and his pretended jurisdiction have no claim over the imperial crown of England. So this sort of long process sort of builds up to a point in 1534 where Henry has done something which is in one sense quite revolutionary. He's declared himself to be supreme head on earth of the church in England. England is now the only still sort of nominally Catholic church within the sort of Latin Christendom, not without owing any allegiance to the Pope. So it's a revolutionary change, but it's also quite a limited one in many respects. It's a jurisdictional change, which means that the Pope's name is to be erased out of all the service books, and Henry's name as king is to be written in their place. But in terms of how most people experienced religion, in terms of the content of church services, that kind of thing, the break with Rome doesn't really have a very dramatic effect.